principal trait de mon caractère, vanité. La qualité que je désire chez un homme, l'intelligence. La qualité que je préfère chez une femme, beauté. Ce que j'apprécie le plus chez mes amis, intelligence. Mon principal défaut, vanité. Mon occupation préférée, jardinage. Mon rêve de bonheur, changer le monde. Quel serait mon plus grand malheur de souffrir physiquement? Ce que je voudrais être, un bienfaiteur. Le pays que je désirerais vivre, la France. La couleur que je préfère, bleu. Le fleur que j'aime, la rose. L'oiseau que je préfère, le moineau. Mes auteurs préférés en prose, Shakespeare. Mes poètes préférés, Yeats, Swinburne et Shakespeare. Mes héros préférés dans la fiction, Superman. Mes héroïnes favorites dans la fiction, Superwoman. Mes compositeurs préférés, ça j'ai pas de goût musical, mais Chopin et Beethoven. Mes peintres favoris, Michel-Ange. Mes héros dans la vie réelle, De Gaulle et Churchill. Mes héroïnes dans l'histoire, Jeanne d'Arc. Mes noms préférés, Valentine et Robert. Ce que je déteste par-dessus tout, la vanité. Caractère que je méprise le plus, vanité. Le fait militaire que j'estime le plus, le courage. La réforme que j'admire le plus, les soins de santé. Le don de la nature que je voudrais avoir, l'intelligence. Comment j'aimerais mourir sans douleur. État présent de mon esprit, espoir et résignation. Faute qui m'inspire le plus d'indulgence, la vanité. Ma devise, au l'histoire qui mal y pense.
Très joli.
Is that enough for you?
That's good.
My name is Valentine Abdy. My father was a collector of art. My mother was a very distinguished aristocrat. She was lady-in-waiting to the Queen, and her whole life was spent in doing good things. My father was devoted to beauty in all its shapes and forms and sizes. And I myself had trouble finding a purpose, an identity, and a mission in life. Now ask me a question.
So what did you do to find your calling and your mission in life?
I just let life go on and waited for it to present its opportunities to me. I left school almost hopeless, having failed all my exams of every kind and at every level, and not being ambitious or without any specific aim. I enjoyed art, but didn't feel... I was frustrated with not being able to create it, so I didn't know where it was going to take me. Ask me another question.
Where were you born?
London.
London. And where did you go to school?
Eton.
And what did you think of Eton?
I thought it was an admirable school. I was unhappy all my life as a schoolboy.
What do you remember that was positive out of Eton?
A certain individuality.
And your parents?
I admired both of them for different reasons.
You were in England and then you moved to France, or did you travel the world?
No, I travelled very little. I was quite happy living in Cornwall. When I was 18, the day before I was supposed to start my military service for 2 years in Malaya, my mother, who was driving, was in a terrible car crash I was in a coma for 3 weeks, and she was mad for 12 years before she died. I wished to leave England, although I got on very well with my father. I wished to separate myself from everything and everybody, and came to Paris and fell in love with Paris. I had lived in London for a little bit, mostly in the country, in Cornwall, but a little bit in London, and I'd never liked London. I fell in love with Paris from the word first day, without speaking a word of French.
And when you went to Rome, for example, or when you went to...
I liked and enjoyed Rome enormously, but for me it was much smaller than Paris, and I never thought I would ever live there. The city that attracted me the most, other than Paris, was New York, which I was really excited by, really thrilled by it, and admired intensely the American way of life, how they considered everyday existence. But after 6 months, I decided that I was basically European, and probably my life was going to take place in Europe.
So when you moved to Paris, how old were you and what did you do?
I was 18. I got taken on, entirely thanks to my father's intervention, by the second biggest gallery in the world, which was then Knoedler's. Wildenstein was the biggest, Knoedler's was the second biggest. And I was employed as an errand boy, first of all in New York, and then in Paris, where they had a buying office in the Rue de Capucine. And all I did was classify the books, run errands for people, and I had no specific status. They had promised me that in 5 or 6 years' time I could run the offices in Paris and in London. But in point of fact, the person who was then my superior, who was the then director, got sacked 6 months after I had joined, and I was far too young and far too inexperienced to even think of taking his place. And so I left on very friendly terms and opened my own gallery, dealing mainly in old master drawings, a subject on which I had infinitesimal knowledge, but which seemed, because of my father's background, a fairly safe stepping stone. And friends of my parents came and visited me. Some of them intelligent, some of them rich, and most of them sympathetic. And I survived in this way for 6 or 7 years, not always frustrated by my lack of creativity, but getting pleasure out of seeing beautiful things, having very little pleasure out of making money, except that it enabled me to buy fast motor cars, which was my principal source of physical pleasure in those days. And thanks to my father and thanks to his introductions, I had a very wealthy and intelligent banker who was kind to me, called Elie de Rothschild. And after about 7 years, he said to me that if I did something intelligent, he would help me. And I said, I'm very flattered. What do you consider something intelligent? And he said, why don't you open an office for the English sale rooms for Sotheby's? And simply, without even telling my father, I wrote to the head of Sotheby's and said that the director of Rothschild's in Paris had suggested that I open an office for Sotheby's, and would he be at all interested? After 2 or 3 weeks, he replied to me very politely and said he was studying the question, and he suggested that I come to London and work with Sotheby's for 3 weeks, at the end of which time he would give me an answer. Is this going on for too long? My first day in Sotheby's, when I was put in the impressions department, I was taken out by 2 very rich young men. One was an Argentinian and one was a German, who asked me what I was doing. I told them my story, and they both laughed. And they both said Sotheby's have been thinking of opening an office in Europe for the last 20 years. There's no chance of you being taken on, but you can come and have coffee with us every day. I was a little discouraged and went back to the impressionist department where I was posted. And the first day, the director came in, stopped in front of my desk where I was looking in the Royal Catalogue, and said, "You must meet Valentine Abdy. The board of Sotheby's has just appointed him our new director in Paris." All 40 people in the impressionist department stopped breathing. So from then it evolved very well. I opened an office in my dirty little place in Paris. I had 2 very intelligent and very supportive secretaries, and people queued up to sell their works of art in London and in New York. On a purely financial basis, the office cost £30,000 a year, and we made between 7 and 10 million pounds in exports. After 3 to 4 years' time, I suggested opening an office in Switzerland where we could have public sales. This was turned down by London, and I said, well, can I go to Germany? Can I open a second office in Germany, a small office, because I think Germany has a big financial potential. And this time Sotheby's gave me the green light, and I went to Munich without speaking a word of German, but looking rather German. And it went very well. It was much harder, more difficult to seduce the Germans than it was in France. But the office, which was also supported by 2 very intelligent secretaries, made a big profit. And I ran both offices for 7 or 8 years. Then, which was very flattering for me, they both had to be expanded. I liked working by myself, and so I decided the time had come, without having any specific aim in my life, to leave. And so on good terms with everybody, I resigned, and happily for me was offered a job by the Baronet in Brussels to join his very wealthy company. It was a very small company, it was very wealthy, called Artemis. Artemis was, at those days, extremely wealthy. We could put over £5 million in any picture. And it was run by a brilliant, totally brilliant man called David Carrot, who was director of Christie's Old Master Department at the age of 17. He was, to my mind, the greatest and most brilliant expert in art that I have ever met. And Artemis was a very tough, purely financial organization with which I had very little sympathy. But the 3 years that I spent with was always surrounded by very, very remarkable people, and crowned above all by David Carrot. My one personal recollection, my only single story, was that he and Pierre Rosenberg, who was the director of the Louvre, had organized an immense retrospective collection of Chardin. And David Carrot was dying. He had 3 weeks to live, and he came over to Paris in a wheelchair. And for 3.5 hours in the evening, with only electric lights, Pierre Rosenberg wheeled him around the Chardin exhibition. I followed like a shadow in the background. And they had physical pleasure looking at Dead Cherries by Chardin. I felt like Fellini. After that, I left. I admired everybody, but I left. It wasn't at all for me a sympathetic experience. It was one which taught me a lot, but it was not agreeable. And I did nothing for 4 or 5 years. And again, thanks to my parents, I met a lot of intelligent and artistically minded people. And one of them was Countess Bismarck, Mona Bismarck, whose father was a groom in the deep south of America. She'd married the son of her father's employer, become very wealthy. And she, like myself, had spent 30 years in France, spoke French very badly, but loved Paris. And we became great friends. And after, let me say, 15, 20 years of friendship, she called me up one day when I was getting divorced and said, "Valentine, you have nothing better to do today. You must come and have dinner tonight. There's somebody I want you to meet." And in our long friendship, she had never introduced me to anybody specific. And so I appeared at dinner not knowing who I was going to meet, who I was going to see. It was somebody called Dillon Ripley, who'd been secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington for 18 years. I had visited the museums in Washington but knew nothing about the Smithsonian. And at the end of dinner, Dillon Ripley had taken me on as his personal representative in Europe, with no effort at all. And from then on, and for the next 18 or 19 years, my life was devoted to helping the Smithsonian, something which I enjoyed immeasurably. I think very much motivated by the memory of my mother, who had died when I was only 18, and who insisted on doing good deeds all her life. And I felt the Smithsonian, with its increase in diffusion of knowledge across the world, was something so admirable that I could only assist it. And this has literally been the purpose and the satisfaction, the aim, the intent of my entire existence.